In this lesson, we're going to spend some time talking about the state of the Russian Empire during the First World War. We'll talk about the political, economic, and social problems of wartime. We'll talk about the opposition and the collapse of autocracy. And we'll talk about the political developments up to 1917. We're going to talk about basically the state of Russia in World War I in this video, and we will spend the next lesson talking about the 1917 revolutions, specifically and individually, if that makes sense. So fundamentally then, let's think about the political problems. Ultimately, the First World War begins when a Serb nationalist by the name of Gavrilo Princip murders or assassinates the Archduke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo. This sparks a chain of events due to the fact that we have a number of different alliances within the various different European empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire declares war on the Serbs. This brings the Russian Empire into the fold, given that Nicholas pledged support for Slavic peoples, essentially, support for his Slavic brothers, and so supported the Serbs during the war. This brought Germany into the war on the side of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also brought France into the war on the side of the Russian and the Serbs due to French and Russian alliances. Great Britain joined the war due to the fact that Germany refused to respect the neutrality of Belgium, launching what was known as the Schlieffen Plan, a plan to essentially go around through Belgium to attack France, which brought Great Britain into the war. And so before you know it, you have a world war that is taking place mostly in Europe, in fact, but still a significant conflict. Tsar Nicholas II, of course, governed Russia as an autocrat. We know this. He had complete control over the state, and he had complete control over the military. His reluctance to implement meaningful political reforms and to modernize Russia would create widespread discontent, as you can probably imagine. He was successful in industrializing the Russian economy, but it was far too slow, and it was far too late when thinking about the beginning of the First World War in 1914. As the war broke out in 1914, Tsar Nicholas began to increasingly see himself as somebody who should take personal control of the military. This wouldn't happen until a little bit later on, but he eventually takes personal control of every single military decision. This is seen as an act of responsibility, but ultimately proved to be disastrous. He was not a military leader. He was not a military general. His leadership was increasingly criticized due to the poor military performance and heavy losses on the Eastern Front. There are various different campaigns and various different battles that were fundamentally difficult for Russia to bounce back from. While Nicholas the Second was at the front, his wife Tsarina Alexandra was left in charge of domestic affairs. This is problematic for two reasons. The first is that Alexandra was a deeply unpopular and distrusted figure among the Russian population because she was a German princess, and of course the Russians were at war with the Germans at this time. Her reliance also on a controversial mystic figure, Rasputin, who had a considerable influence over her and her husband, also further eroded the credibility of monarchy. Despite Russia's industrialization, then, the political reforms were virtually non-existent, and so the Duma at the time had very limited power, calls for reform were ignored, and the lack of democratic institutions made it very difficult for the Tsar to operate during a major world conflict. But it was the economic problems that were most prevalent during this time. We can see huge economic problems and economic strains that is caused by the First World War. Beginning first with the depreciation of the currency and inflation, the Russian government's response to the wartime financial demands was to issue substantial increases in paper currency, so essentially printing more money. Now, this is problematic for one major reason. essentially, when you print more of something, the value of that thing will start to decrease. The decreasing in the value of currency, or by contrast, the increasing in the price of goods relative to that value, is known as inflation. Now, from 1914 to 1917, the amount of ruble notes in circulation went from around 1.6 billion ruble notes to nearly 10 billion. So a major, nearly 5 times increase in the amount of ruble notes in circulation between 14 and 17. The expansion then leads to a dramatic rise in inflation. For example, by the end of 1916, prices had doubled compared to 1914 levels. By February 1917, the ruble's purchasing power had diminished to approximately 30 kopecks in terms of pre-war terminologies. The government's reliance then on printing money as a way to try and fund the war was a primary factor for this inflation. The state bank, for example, was starting to print 20 to 30 million rubles per day in 1915. This increased to 50 million rubles per day by early 1917. The result is that with the excessive currency issuance, therefore lowering the value of an individual currency, coupling this with the price controls that are on essential goods, you see that essentially we get a destabilizing economy as well as a thriving and growing black market economy that is, again, problematic for the fact that essentially a black market economy does not have the same kind of controls over it that a normal market economy might have. In terms of through the industrial sector, we know that it was already the Russian industry, the Russian industrial economy was still underdeveloped compared to that of Western powers. And so it faced even more setbacks during the war. We see, for example, labour productivity in the coal industry declining from 12.2 tons per month in the Donbass region before the war to as low as 9 tons in the winter of 1916. That's a major drop. The decrease was attributed to both the replacement of skilled labour with unskilled workers, and also the fact that we have most of the labour force going to war, being in the war effort. So it meant that instead of having skilled labour, you had prisoners of war, you had women, you had children operating in these industrial environments. By 1916, the German occupation of some of Russia's most productive regions led to a decrease in around 20% when it came to the output in those factories. Additionally, we see agricultural crises. Approximately 16 million men, or 47% of the adult male population, were drafted into the military, which meant that we see a massive depletion of the rural workforce. And so, when we see in the agricultural productivity, we also see the drastic falling of agricultural machinery being produced, a dropping of around half or 50% of pre-war levels by 1915, and as low as 20% by 1916. Again, food shortages are going to cause widespread social unrest. The government's attempts to control prices led to peasants withholding grain from the market, going to black markets. The increasing in inflation coupling with this controlling of prices meant that you would basically get no money for, or get no value for the goods that you sell, meaning that you would more likely profit on a black market. So in order to finance the war, we can see that the main option that the Russian government went for was currency depreciation, essentially issuing more and more currency, but they also went for a policy of borrowing and a combination of taxation with that as well. All of these measures proved to be completely insufficient to the growing and taxing demands of the war effort. In 1914, the state budget deficit was as high as 40% of expenditures. This number had risen to nearly 80% by 1916. Taxation contributed very little to the war effort, and therefore the burden additionally would fall on the lower parts of the classes in society. Internally, the government would issue bonds and increase the circulation of paper money, as we've already noted earlier on. By January 1917, credit notes in circulation was as high as 9 billion rubles, compared to only 1.5 billion rubles in 1914. We've noted that already when we looked at the currency circulation, when we looked at inflation and currency depreciation. Ultimately then, all of this means that we can see a massive impact on the population. Urban workers experience rising living costs. We can see that a deteriorating in working conditions. In the countryside, peasants struggled with food shortages, high taxes, conscription, many deaths, lots of loss, and widespread dissatisfaction and resistance. The cumulative effect of these economic problems would lead to the events that we see in February 1917. In terms of the continuing social problems, there's clearly worker unrest. The war dragged on, and the working class of the Russian state became increasingly disillusioned. The government's response was often brutal to the protests and strikes. In 1916, for example, discontent within the working class intensified and became more and more frequent. In the countryside, we see worsening economic conditions. The value of your labor, essentially, or the value of your farm produce becomes more and more worthless as inflation increases and price controls stay the same. The Russian army, which had been poorly equipped, was beginning to lose battles. It was losing morale. The soldiers, many of whom were peasants, faced extreme hardships. The result is a massive opposition to Nicholas II. We see a rise in the popularity of social movements, of revolutionary movements. The Social Revolutionary Party, for example, and the Bolsheviks saw a rise in their popularity. The opposition within the Duma began to grow as well. In 1915, for example, a series of Duma members formed what became known as the Progressive Bloc, calling for reforms and the establishment of a more accountable system of government. Again, these are reforms that were ignored by Nicholas II. By early 1917, then, Russia was on the brink of collapse, and all it took was a rumour of more and more bread rations for the February Revolution to break out. The February Revolution will be the topic of the next lesson.